Let's see, we're recording. So let me, a couple of preliminary things. I had asked the staff to contact those we had not heard from, and the one response we got was that Jim Brinton, who is the first selectman of the town of Washington, said that he's just terribly busy, didn't anticipate that that was going to change. So he relinquished his spot on the committee, very kindly invited us to have someone take his place. I'm not sure that that's practical at this point, but it looks like he will not be part of our work going forward, but we will, I'll certainly keep him in the loop as we move ahead. Second, we'll, after the speakers, we'll circle back to the further draft outline that I circulated, but and I'm also wondering if we're going to hear something from the group that's drafting why affordable housing is important. But I otherwise, I would just tell you my impression. I wonder if any of you have the same feeling. It seems like every day I get 7 or 8 emails and articles and stuff. The amount of debate in this state about affordable housing right now is just astonishing, and which is good. You know, I mean, it's one of my professors used to say, "Flood and settle." You know, the tide washes in and then it washes out, and then you see what's left. But the tide, it seems like is really washing in, you know, not just in Fairfield County, but all over the state. There are letters to the editor and op-eds and webinars and all kinds of stuff. So I think we're tackling a timely topic at a critical point. So good for us. So on the screen, we have Aaron Boggs and Sam Giffen from the Open Communities Alliance. I've known both of them for a long time. And obviously, one of the things that is critical to what we're going to produce eventually is this issue of identifying affordable housing need. And OCA has been in the forefront of this issue in a variety of ways, but most recently and most particularly with their advocacy of what is called fair share zoning. And I'm not going to steal their thunder and let them explain it, but I will say that this past Tuesday, they did Aaron and Sam, joined by John Koskowski, the planner, who has also been very active in producing, I think he said about 20 of the affordable housing plans that have been done so far. He actually went through the exercise of taking the fair share concept, a number of units targeted for Glastonbury as the town of choice, and produced a slideshow about specific steps, concrete steps that one can use to implement a fair share program. And I thought this is right in our wheelhouse. So the method of my madness is I want Aaron and Sam to explain to you all, as I've learned it in detail over the years, what fair share is all about. And then I think maybe at our next meeting, I'm going to have John Koskowski come and reprise for us this presentation that he did on Tuesday night, because it really was a good example, certainly not the only example, but a really good example. Hi, Claudette. A really good example of, you know, the kind of concrete steps that I think we want to encourage towns to do. So I've asked Aaron and Sam to talk to us for 20-25 minutes, and then we can have a little discussion about that. And then we'll turn back to the content of our report and maybe start giving out some assignments. So Aaron and Sam, welcome. We're very pleased that you could join us, and take it away.
All right, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting us. And I'm going to kick things off and then hand it over to Sam. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And let's see here. And you guys can let me know if it's showing up correctly for you. You see it?
Looks good.
All right, good. We wanted to, we're going to try to hit a couple of things in here, and part of it maybe, I hope it's not stuff you've already reviewed, and if it is, I can go through it faster. You guys can feel free to jump in, but we wanted to hit at the notion of fair share and sort of the structure that we're working in, which is partly how we got to fair share. And then we've had a chance to look at some of the affordable housing plans, so we'll just briefly touch on that. Again, if I'm repeating stuff that this group has already had presentations on, please let me know. So, we come to this by looking at the various different pieces of the land use structure in Connecticut. And we think of that as something that has sort of these overarching laws, like the Connecticut Constitution and fair housing laws, that then inform state planning obligations, like the state plan of plan of conservation and development and consolidated plan, the fair housing assessment, which then in turn inform town planning and zoning, including through 8-2. And then there's also a piece of this that includes some incentives and enforcement. So I'm just going to talk through those relatively quickly. Fair housing laws, as you may know, at the federal level, prohibit government policies that have a disparate impact on particular groups that aren't justified by a strong non-discriminatory reason. An example is unjustified policies that limit the development of affordable housing. That's going to have what's called a disparate impact on Black and Latino households, because they, just as a matter of statistics, have less income and less wealth, and so are in greater need of affordable housing. And that can be true of families or households with a member who has a disability too, and other particular groups. The Connecticut Constitution in Article 1, Section 20 has basically a non-segregation clause, an anti-segregation clause. So that has to inform the behavior of government around zoning. And we have a state Fair Housing Act, which is pretty much an analog to the federal Fair Housing Act. We also have a series of planning obligations that the state has to comply with that are also, sort of coming out of these other obligations that I just outlined. These include the consolidated plan, the assessment of fair housing, the state plan of conservation and development. The consolidated plan, the source for that is found both in federal and state law. It has to be submitted ultimately to HUD every 5 years. We're in the middle of a con plan right now. And the goal is to help states and local jurisdictions assess their affordable housing and community development needs and market conditions, and make data-driven place-based investment decisions. And it includes an obligation to provide a concise summary of the jurisdiction's estimated housing needs projected for the ensuing 5-year period. So there's a very clear existing obligation for the state to come up with a need for affordable housing. The assessment of fair housing, which was previously known as the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, is a federal obligation for folks or for entities that get money, government entities that get money from HUD. It has to be submitted every 5 years. And its goal is to ensure that these grantees are taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination, to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity. It includes a data analysis, including the need for affordable housing among groups that fall within the protected classes. It then has a required assessment of the barriers to affordable housing or to integration and opportunity access, and a requirement then to establish a plan with real goals to address it. So again, this is another place where there's an existing obligation on the part of the state to come up with that need for affordable housing. And then last, the state plan of conservation and development. That's due every 5 years, and that's the primary, as you probably know, it's the primary document guiding land and water conservation and development. I think unless they have approved it in the last couple of weeks, which maybe they did, it needs to still be approved. And you guys may know if that's, what the status is on that. So I mention all of these mostly to say that we have a structure that is, if you piece these things together, really designed to get us the need for affordable housing and set it up in a way that meets that need and also does it in a way that is not segregated. We then know, I'm sure everyone here is aware of the Zoning Enabling Act. It's one of the obligations on towns. But especially as updated last session in 6107, there's some really important components here that help us, make sure that towns are aware of their obligation to be planning and zoning for all kinds of housing. And I think, as everyone here knows, the power to zone is a state power that is delegated to towns. It's not delegated willy-nilly. It's not the Wild West of planning and zoning for towns, or at least it shouldn't be. There are certain rules that come with the responsibility to zone. And one of these is that municipal zoning be made in accordance with the municipal plan of conservation and development. We'll talk about that in a minute. And that these zoning laws be designed to consider the impact on each town's region, address the disparities in housing needs, access to education, jobs, and other opportunities, affirmatively further fair housing. And what that really means is, with great intentionality, work to combat the history of segregation, provide for the development of housing opportunities, including multifamily housing, for residents of the region, not just the town, promote housing choice and economic diversity, including for low and moderate income households, and then expressly allow the development which will meet the needs identified in the consolidated plan and the state plan of conservation and development. So you can see how these things are knitted together and connect. And I think that's an important part as we think about our overall structure. Municipalities also have to submit their own plan of conservation development every 5 years, or excuse me, every 10 years. The language in terms of affordable housing in the POCD statute is very similar. It's not identical, but it's very similar to what I just outlined for the Zoning Enabling Act. And then there's this newer obligation from 2017 to do municipal affordable housing plans under 8-30J. And, that's getting a lot of attention now because they're coming due. And the statute is pretty sparse on what those plans need to include. All it says is such plan shall specify how the municipality intends to increase the number of affordable housing developments in the municipality.
That's why we're here.
Right. And I think that you can't read that by itself. It's not a statute that's standing out alone in a vacuum. It's actually 8-30J. It's part of all of the other 8- statutes. So you have 8-2, you have 8-23, the Plan of Conservation Development. This is part of a bigger structure for land use that we have in the state. And it really needs to be read in context. It has to be read in context of the Fair Housing Act, of the state constitution. All of these other things have to fit together. And then we have, as you guys are all aware, I'm sure, the sort of this other piece of the puzzle, which deals with enforcement to a certain extent. The Affordable Housing Appeals Act is a critically important component of our ability to create affordable housing. It's really the only tool we have to get it done. But to be clear, it doesn't create any obligations for towns. It's not pegged to the need for affordable housing. And what it does is it creates a tool for developers to use, developers who are building affordable housing, and to use in towns that really haven't followed the rest of all of these rules that we've just been talking about. So that's out there. It's important, but we need to sort of build on that and do more, I think, to make this happen. We also have state and federal fair housing laws. But what we have found in talking to developers about these, and they're the ones that would be most likely to enforce them, is that They're expensive. It takes time to enforce them. And that's true of the Affordable Housing Appeals Act too. And so they can be reluctant to use it. And developers are also reluctant to get a reputation for being litigious. It doesn't help them as they try to advance their business. And so these tools are out there, but we need to go beyond them. So just to recap, we have these overarching rules. They feed into the state planning obligations, which are really, juicy and meaningful in terms of creating more housing and sort of carrying out the vision of the Fair Housing Act. We have these plan obligations, town planning and zoning obligations, and then we have the sort of incentive enforcement piece. And with that, I will hand it over to Sam.
Thank you, Erin, and I'll steal the screen share if I can. Is that working?
Yep, thank you.
Great. So really quick, and before I get into the nuts and bolts of Fair Share, we did recently undergo a review of the 26 affordable housing plans that we could find that are submitted. And a couple highlights are that, less than half actually include numerical goals, and the average numerical goal for the 5-year planning period was less than 44 units, which once we get into Fair Share, you can understand why that's a little bit of a problem for us. There were few numerical need calculations, if any, even fewer. If you consider pairing a need calculation with a production goal, a few plans did acknowledge that there was a need for affordable housing of many, many thousands in terms of the households that are low income and cost burdened, but there was no attachment of that to a production goal. There was little acknowledgement of the fact that according to our Zoning Enabling Act, the need is calculated regionally and is derived from the regional needs of the population. Nor was there much mention of segregation in these plans. What is in the plans is a lot of let's support CHFA subsidized mortgages, which it's worth mentioning, the majority of which do not actually reach low-income households. Around 2/3. And I think that's important because that sort of does not fit the definition of affordable housing, at least on the national standard with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There's a lot of emphasis on senior housing. One might argue out of proportion with the need, especially if we're conceiving need regionally. I think the most prevalent issue we found was that most of the language is non-committal, although the 830J statute doesn't require committal language. A lot of consider this and explore that, which really allows, doesn't allow for any meaningful metrics or enforcement. And then finally, there was little consideration of significant increases in density, which we believe are probably warranted in most cases to increase affordable housing. But enough about the affordable housing plans. I'm going to talk about sort of what Fair Share is and how it works. So it's a 4-step process. The system which we sort of replicated is from New Jersey and based on the Mount Laurel doctrine there. But it also has these 4 steps, and we sort of molded them to Connecticut's laws and legal structure to make sense for this state. So the first step is to determine the affordable housing need by region. The second step is to allocate that regional need number to towns, to all the municipalities in that region in a fair way that considers, the certain characteristics of the towns as well as their history of activities under the Zoning Enabling Act. Step 3 is the actual planning process. So towns update their plans, they update their zoning, and engage in other policies and practices to achieve that fair share obligation. And finally, there is meaningful evaluation and enforcement of these plans. I'll go into each step a little bit more in depth now. So we start with this need calculation. It's the very first step, kind of how we the basis for everything else. And a widely accepted national understanding of affordable housing is housing which doesn't cost more than 30% of a household's income to pay for it. What we see in Connecticut is that that's about 500,000 households are paying more than 30% of their income. So what we have to do, recognizing that that need the need is extremely great, that we have to look at the deeper levels of need. And so if we look at the lowest income bracket of below 30% of the area median income, and only those households that are paying more than half their income for housing, we still have an astronomical number. And considering this is in a 10-year period, building this much housing would be more than Connecticut has done in a long time. So we use this most basic, the most conservative estimate of the needed affordable housing, only the basis being the most extreme need in the state. And that's that 135,000 number at the bottom right. So based on section 8-2, this should be calculated regionally. That's the language there. And so you can see this broken out into the regional council of government areas. You'll notice we've actually combined the metropolitan and western regions, since for our model, it didn't seem to make sense that one region would have only 6 towns where the majority have about 25. And I think it's worth comparing this to the other Affordable Housing Act that Aaron talked about, which was the Appeals Act, and that commonly bandied about a threshold of 10%. So if every town in the state were to reach 10%, if every town that hadn't done so were to reach 10% through building affordable units, that would yield about 41,500 units. And that is about 100,000 short of what, our most conservative estimate of the need for affordable housing. So on to step 2, we take that regional need. I think, if you saw the capital region, for example, had about 36,000 households at 30% of AMI or below, paying more than half of their income towards housing. We allocate that need in a fair methodology to the municipalities in that region. And we utilize 4 allocation factors and a simple average of those 4 allocation factors relative to the other towns in that same region. And these all derive, again, from that Zoning Enabling Act 8-2. So wealth, using the equalized net grand list, income, using median household income, poverty, using the percent living below the poverty line, and multifamily, using the percent of housing that is multifamily. And you can see the relevant section of 8-2 where we were inspired to use those factors. This is just a snapshot of the model in action. Essentially, it's a large spreadsheet. This is available at our website. But I think it's worth pointing out that we use a 20% cap, as they do in New Jersey. So for example, if a town of 1,000 households had been very effective at stymieing development for a very long time, so they had extremely high wealth, extremely high incomes, virtually no multifamily or impoverished populations, relative to other towns in their region, they would have an extremely high fair share. So they might have a fair share of 2,000 households or housing units, which doesn't really make planning sense. So we cap the overall fair share at 20%. In that case, the fair share would be 200 units in that 1,000 unit town. This is just a little map of where the affordable housing obligations, the fair share obligations, are distributed. In the COGs that have far less affordable housing need, the numbers are far smaller. In some of the regions that have a lot higher need, especially those towns which have the greatest amount of wealth, income, and relatively less poverty and multifamily than other places in the region, have the highest units. So I think Greenwich is the highest in the state with over 3,000. So the third part is really the meat of this whole system. The planning process. Towns create fair share plans, and we really have a lot to look at in this part, because we have over 350 examples of municipal fair share plans from New Jersey, where suburbs came to the table and created a fair share plan in order to execute and achieve their fair share obligation in 10 years. We also have now, thanks to John Gieschowski, a local example of policies that could move towards fair share in Glastonbury. And essentially, the plans would include, in most cases, changes to zoning regulations, changes to plans of conservation and development, but also could include commitments to develop specific parcels with agreements with specific developers, which is common in New Jersey. So we like to advertise this as, the local control part. So town ingenuity, creativity, local knowledge, community engagement, these can all be part of the fair share process. Towns can use myriad of tactics and policies. Probably a lot will be accomplished through inclusionary zoning. Probably there will be increases in density, but there will be subsidies that will be employed. There will be public housing authorities, transit-oriented development. Really, all of these are in the tool belts of towns, and there is technical assistance that can be provided by the state to accomplish this. But critically, the plan must actually create a realistic possibility for the development of the units. We also believe and would recommend that the state needs certain guide rails for the types of housing in the plan, because there are a lot of types that are missing from the market and that are simply harder to develop because of their expense. And also don't meet a real need for the lowest incomes or certain household types. As we've seen in affordable housing plans thus far, a lot of towns want to focus on home ownership, but as I mentioned, a lot of the subsidized home ownership doesn't actually reach low-income households. Towns want to focus on elderly housing, but there is an extreme need regionally for housing that is affordable for families with children, and an extreme problem with educational inequity in the state. Also, a lot of developers are not really inclined necessarily to build to the lower AMI levels, to reach the lower and more extreme levels of poverty, but those are extremely needed, and larger bedroom sizes as well. Other integrative policies that we would recommend are simply affirmative marketing, and that intra-town segregation, or towns putting all the fair share obligation in the only high poverty part of town would be sort of prohibited. And that is the relevant clause of the Connecticut Constitution that inspired that. Finally, and under HB 5204, currently in the legislature, the implementation and enforcement would be left to the state, OPM, to create guidelines and provisions for implementation and enforcement. But this is really a critical piece. It is the reason that it's worked so well in New Jersey. And the results in New Jersey really speak for themselves. There have been over 60,000 affordable housing units produced in New Jersey under fair share. But since 2014, according to the executive director of the Fair Share Housing Center in New Jersey, there are over 50,000 more affordable housing units that are in the development pipeline to be produced over the next 10 years, because more than half of New Jersey suburbs have come to the table and created their plans, which they are currently executing. And with that, I believe Aaron and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Sam. I have a couple of quick questions. Sam, could you go back to your screen share for a minute there?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, if you would go back to your slide, I'm going to think it's like number 4, number 5, that has the 135,000 number in the lower right. I think, Could you explain the relationship of the numbers? In other words, well, first of all, is the 135,000, that's 10% of the approximately of the 1,000,003 in the upper left-hand corner? Is that a correct way to read that?
Yes.
Okay. So then on the column on the right, 220,000 households. So that's how many of the 1.3 million you classified as severely cost burdened. And then, so what is the calculation in the next three rows below that? 208, 188.
Right. So descending, they're actually inclusive, or ascending, they're inclusive. So the top row households is all Connecticut households. And so among all Connecticut households, 500,000 about are paying more than 30% of their income, and over 200,000 are paying more than half of their income. So if you only look at households that are considered low income by HUD, so below 80% of the area median income, about 400,000 households are paying more than 30%. And still about 200,000 are paying more than half. And so as you go down and further, you're excluding slightly the higher income tiers, the tiers above that. So the tiers above 50% and the tiers above 30%. And so you're removing these households, which still need affordable housing, to be sure. But given the magnitude of those numbers, we believe we should start with the most conservative estimate of affordable housing need. And that's a family of four making about $30,000 a year, paying more than half of that towards housing costs.
Okay. I think this is this is the hardest slide to get your arms around. So if I sort of say it in my own terms, the households column is the measure of income, below 80%, below 50%, below 30%. And then the right-hand column is what percentage of that income they're paying for housing. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay. All right. So then is the 135,000 the number that you then allocated to the various planning regions?
Yes.
Okay. And then just to finish that off, then that 135,000 number was distributed based on those factors that wealth, poverty, et cetera, but with a cap of 20% so that you didn't have population in any one given town.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I'll just weigh in with two other thoughts. One is that in New Jersey, I think it's about a third of the housing that's was created through inclusionary zoning units. So
Right.
inclusionary developments, so that you end up with maybe 15% of the units as deed restricted affordable and the remaining market rate units. But because they're likely to be denser, like in a whole range of different kinds of multifamily housing, from missing middle to larger, you end up creating housing that, while market rate affordable, is going to be more affordable than, let's say, a large lot single family home. And so that number that is the target that we based everything on doesn't capture everybody who needs affordable housing, but the system will generate housing that is more affordable in those market rate units that are in those inclusive developments. So I think that's a really important component to this. And I think another important component is, as you saw from the recommendations Sam offered around the various affordability levels, that 135,000 number, which comes from families who are at 30% AMI and paying more than half of their income towards housing costs, doesn't translate exactly into creating units that are affordable at 30% of AMI, paying only, paying 50% or less of income towards housing costs. And that's because lots more units are going to be created. So with the inclusionary units, so when you infuse a market with 120, 130,000 units of housing, you're going to start affecting prices in the market. So overall prices are going to be coming down. And then there's going to be a reshuffle in the market where some people who are in housing that is more than they can pay are going to move to less expensive housing and vice versa. So that it's really about creating that number of units. And so I just wanted to hone in on that and mention that as well.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. Sam, now you could unshare your screen so I can see the masses huddled. And Rick, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks, Tim. Hey, thanks for that presentation, really illuminating. And Aaron, I appreciate what you were just saying about how one byproduct or one aspect of the work in New Jersey is that it enabled or promoted or encouraged the market to create a significant number of affordable housing units. That's an issue I hope we can address in this group as well. I think, you know, I was in New Jersey when the Mount Laurel decision was made. I was in City Hall in Trenton, where we appreciated the possibility that more affordable housing could be built in more different places. You, OCA, and the Partnership for Strong Communities and some other groups have done some really good work talking about why constructing or making available more affordable housing is a good thing and can serve the community interests of more different places, both economically and socially. And I hope that's another aspect of the work we do in this task force is try yet again to explain to people across the state why affordable housing can contribute so significantly to the life of the state. Here's my quick question. What can we learn from New Jersey's experience over the last 25, 30 years that we could use here in Connecticut to explain why the infusion or the creation of significant new numbers of affordable housing units is a good thing for individual communities and for the state as a whole? What can we share through our task force work as to why this is good?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would certainly, if there's time, we would certainly be happy to facilitate getting some folks from New Jersey to speak to this group. We know that developers in New Jersey are building and building and building. So, you know, we know that the economic impact that that a region sees from that kind of development is happening there, and they can speak to that. There's also various estimates that have been made by CHFA and the home builders and other groups that demonstrate all of the economic benefits of this kind of development that really run from the actual money that's infused into an economy because building is happening and building materials are being purchased and people who are working to build the housing are getting paid, to how they turn around and then people who live in the housing turn around and spend their money in the local economy. And then on top of that, the amount of money that is saved by families who now are not spending half of their income on housing. And that is, I think, tremendous when we think about saving for retirement and college and all of the things that lead over a longer term to a stronger, healthier community and state. And Sam, please feel free to add to that if there's anything else.
No, I mean, I think you can't talk about the economic benefits enough in terms of GDP growth, in terms of local and state tax revenue, in terms of reversing the outmigration, and just being able to start businesses, being able to put employees into jobs that are critical for the growth in the state. I think that's really probably the biggest selling point for a lot of folks, other than the clear, racial justice imperative and integration. I mean, there's also great data on how New Jersey has integrated as a result of this. But I mean, it goes without saying that the economic growth would be very convincing to a lot of people.
Matt, and then iPad 2, which I believe is Kathy Randall. Go ahead, Matt.
In looking at that map, let's just take Greenwich, for example, was 3,500, 3,700 new units. That's just affordable, correct? So how many market rate units would need to be created to do that? Are we looking at what Aaron said was like 15% inclusionary? So 85% would be market rate?
It would, I mean, what's happened in New Jersey is only a third of the units that are created that are affordable are coming through those inclusionary developments, and the rest are coming from units that are, more fully affordable. So you wouldn't have those inclusionary developments. I think a lot of this is up to the towns, and it's up to what's going on in the local market and what can be sustained with an inclusionary development. I think in a place like Greenwich, where you're on a train line, where you can do amazing stuff with transit-oriented development, there's going to be a lot of potential to build both kinds of units. But if they want inclusionary units, but also maybe even inclusionary at a higher percentage of affordable too. Another thing to add that we haven't emphasized very much, but it's something that they're doing in New Jersey, and which we would absolutely recommend be part of a Connecticut process, is that you translate each of those fair share units into points. And then you award extra points for certain kinds of housing that are particularly needed in the market. Those could be those 2 and 3 bedroom units, supportive housing, maybe even energy efficient housing. It could be housing that is being rented to families with housing vouchers. Housing that is accessible to people with mobility challenges. So there's all kinds of ways where we can really meet the urgent need that's out there and reward towns for that, and have them thereby lower their overall building obligation. There's also strategies about conversion, and part of what's included in John Guskowski's report are some estimates around look, if you just change what's allowed to in certain zones so that you can have those 4 or 6 unit missing middle kinds of homes, you're not building up, you're sort of taking something you already have and just converting it, or maybe taking it down and putting something else up on the same lot. So I think when you start looking at all these strategies together, and Greenwich, you're taking the example of the highest, place in the state. So it's fair to take it. We've got to look at it because it has to work there. And that's one of the reasons we took Glastonbury, because it has a pretty significant number. We wanted to see, can we make it work in a place that has a really meaningful obligation? So we could try to play it out in Greenwich, but we have seen it work in Glastonbury, and there are lots of places that are, I think, on the order of Greenwich in New Jersey that are making it work as well.
I mean, I just chose Greenwich because that's what caught my eye.
Yeah.
On the map. I mean, at Weston there at 600, so the question, so let's say in a utopian world, 135 units are created. The people that we're talking about already exist in the state. They're what happens to the units that they're currently in? So
this is a plan to succeed. So we've been losing population, right? Connecticut has been losing population. We want to be gaining population. So part of this would be attracting people to the state, and that's exactly what's happened in New Jersey. And part of it would be about housing people. We right now, OCA is representing about 250 families from the north end of Hartford who had to leave their housing because the conditions in this HUD subsidized building were so awful. So there's some of that will happen. There are people who are doubled up, and there'll be this reshuffling in the market. But and we have like the Glastonbury Housing Authority right now. We were just on a webinar with folks from Glastonbury on Tuesday night. They have a waiting list of 1,000 people So like even a tiny little housing authority like that has a very long waiting list. So the demand is huge, but it will involve, I mean, part of the sort of secret here is we're bringing in new folks to the state who can contribute to our economy, who'll be buying and renting market rate housing as a way to help, without government subsidy, offset the cost of the affordable units that we need.
I just say, well, sorry, Tim, real quick. I have 3 kids. So far, 2 of them have left the state, and as Partnership for Strong Communities, among others, have pointed out, some of that has to do with new households being able to afford to establish themselves independently. And I believe there's a lot of potential for growth there too, for our own children to be able to stay here. That's my view of it. Thanks.
And I forget the statistic, but there's some, I mean, it's a wild statistic about how many, it's like 50% of people within a certain, like just out of college age bracket are living at home with their parents. I mean, it's like amazing. It's an amazingly high number.
Yeah. Kathy, is that you, iPad 2? You have a question?
Yes, hi, thank you for that presentation. Actually, I think Matthew had asked what I had in my mind as well. Where are the 135,000 people coming from? I actually went to a CBIA conference this morning, and they were just talking about how many people are leaving Connecticut, and over 41% of the people on a national basis leaving the labor force are coming from Connecticut. So we're a small state, but we are a huge percentage. So I guess I'm just wondering, if you build it, will they come? And I'm wondering about some of the people maybe who are in the cities. I guess we're trying to, the idea is to move from cities to rural. Has anyone ever asked people in the cities, do you want to move? What would you like if you did move? Again, we talked about demand and supply in one of our last sessions, and we talk a lot about supply, but the market does operate on demand and supply. And are these people going to have cars? If they don't have cars now, that would be an additional expense. Are their jobs, closer to the city? I just, some of this is, it's a very nice thought theoretically, but practically speaking, we're trying to build all new infrastructure, sewer, water, education. So I'm just wondering, are there going to be some unintended consequences? And should we be looking at maybe making our cities more vibrant instead of trying to force people out of something? I mean, maybe a year or 2 ago, there was an article in the Hartford Courant about a woman who was trying to get back on her feet. She had been incarcerated, actually. She had a couple kids. I think she was living with her sister. And they had rats and they had bugs. And it took over 6 months for the city of Hartford to even get an inspector out there. So, there's an old saying, why do people rob banks? Because that's where the money is. The multitude of the people are in the cities. That's where our infrastructure is. Should we be trying to revitalize our cities? I also have 2 kids, 22 and 23, that just left to go to Boston. They're paying outrageous rents in Boston, but it's a vibrant city. There's transportation, there's infrastructure. So again, I really like the concept of giving people affordable housing, but are we looking in the right places? And, you mentioned that the rents are going to come down. You haven't been on some of the other calls, but I finance commercial real estate. And I noticed with, some of these low-income housing tax credits, the price per unit is so high that what happens is the market rents for everybody else have to increase. So you're really increasing overall rents, oftentimes for people who are on the margin. Maybe they just can't afford they're not getting the assistance. And this is sometimes maybe why people are leaving. So I guess that was a lot in there, but I guess I'm saying, are we looking in the right places? Are we doing the right things? I mean, I heard Claudette talk about people in New Haven who are getting priced out. I think we heard from Antonio Edwards last time about people living under the underpasses or living in their cars. And I feel like some of this is going to take 3, 4, 5 years to accomplish. Should we be trying to help these people who are living under an underpass or in their cars because, you know, they don't necessarily need a 1,200 square foot unit with a granite countertop. You know, should we be looking at doing something for them a little bit more immediate in the cities? So anyway, as I say, that was a lot, but just some of my thoughts, because you know, as I say, I've been in the real estate world a long time, and I see what happens with the market forces. Sometimes theory's nice, but when you have supply and demand and people wanting a certain place to live, you can't really orchestrate that. So
there were a lot of questions there, so I'm going to try to unpack it. I know they're good questions. They're all good questions. You know, I think part of what's nice about Fair Share is that we do have a place where we're seeing it in action, and we're seeing it work in New Jersey. So that's one thing that's really nice about it. But let me see if I can sort of parse this a little bit, and Sam may want to jump in with some responses as well. So on the choice question, we have gone through several processes of engaging with families who are living in higher poverty communities about where they want to live, and particularly families who are currently relying on government subsidies. And you know, part of the heart of this is we have, you know, a legal obligation to make sure that certainly our government systems are not limiting these choices and creating segregation. So like that's an entry point for us, at least. And when we talk to families and survey families about where they're interested in living, it actually ends up being about 50-50. So about half of the families say, I really, really, really want to go. I'm living in this neighborhood because it's the only place I could find to live. And then about half of the families say, this is my neighborhood. This is where my family has lived for generations. This is where my church is. This is where my community is. I absolutely want to stay. And please, please, please help me make it a vibrant and opportunity-rich place to be. So we need to do both things. We need to be allowing choices, because right now, the fact of the matter is, it is almost impossible, if you're relying on government assistance, or even if you're not and you're low income, maybe especially if you're not, to move out of a place that's a higher poverty place. And that's wrong. Like that, and the other problem that creates is it ends up building on itself, because you end up increasing poverty concentration to higher levels than it is already. Because what we have done with our government subsidized housing policies over the last forever, 50 years, is we continue to put subsidized housing in areas that are high poverty and where there already is lots of subsidized housing. And we do it again and again and again and again. And we now have neighborhoods throughout the state where 40-60% of the housing stock is subsidized by the government. And that doesn't count families who are relying on Section 8, who also, you know, have mobile vouchers and also live in the neighborhood. So like that, we've sort of done the thing where we just try to get help to the person under the underpass who is important, and we need to make sure they have a roof over their head. But we have to think bigger than that, because if we just do that again and again, we're creating an environment where we're going to just replicate that, and we will continue to have people living under passes, and we will continue to have concentrated poverty and cycles of poverty that we can't break. So like that's that piece on choice. I also think if we do this right, we will set the stage for revitalization in our cities. We know right now that we need 135,000 units of affordable housing. If we suddenly magically, let's say we could do this the other way around, we could revitalize our cities, and then suddenly everything that has been expressed to us as a concern from our clients who are living in neighborhoods that are struggling was fixed. Suddenly the schools were high performing. Suddenly the municipal services were operating in a fantastic way. Suddenly all the streets were safe. the first thing that would happen is people would want to move into those neighborhoods. There's some fantastic things about living in an urban environment. It's walkable, it's near stores, it's near stuff to do. It's really great. And suddenly exactly the families that we are most concerned about at OCA would be very likely to be displaced. And so if we can do this right, we can create the housing we need, we can create the room in the market so that there can be revitalization in cities. We can make sure that in places like New Haven, where you have slumlords really taking advantage of people because they have nowhere else to go, don't have the ability to do that. Like, we can make a lot of this happen in a way that's positive for the whole state. And Sam, do you want to talk about jobs and transportation?
Okay, we're right at
Thank you,
5
Aaron.
o'clock. Yeah. Matt Danza, you've been patient. Why don't you get your question and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Sure, and it's actually a fairly quick question. When we're talking about the housing stock in New Jersey and the additional units that have been added, both through the actual programs and then just private building that has included affordable housing, is that deed restricted? Because I know at our most recent meeting, I wasn't able to attend, but I did watch the recording. There was discussion about the 40-year deed restriction for counting units as affordable. And so I'm wondering what they were doing in New Jersey, whether that's part of it or whether the assessment was just purely on how much the unit actually cost.
Sam, I've talked a lot. You want to handle that? I can if you don't want to.
Sure. No, yeah. They have similar requirements. Deed restricted, I believe that the term is 40 years. But it also, again, includes a lot of undeed restricted units that are more affordable because of the higher density that comes with the inclusionary.
And are there barking dogs in those units? No, just kidding.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a mix. It's a mix of deed restricted, but then also counting new units that are built that are not deed restricted but are affordable.
Sorry, no, it's only counting deed restricted units. So that's the 60,000 already completed and the 50,000 in the pipeline. Those are just deed restricted affordable. The 200,000 already completed and probably approximately that in the pipeline are market rate, not counted under fair share, but just worth noting.
And Tim, if you have time, I have a 1-minute response on the jobs and transportation, which is just 2 facts, really.
Yeah.
Hartford Foundation came out with a report about 3 or 4 years ago, which found that of families in Hartford who earn $40,000 a year or less, about 60% of them left Hartford every day to go to work. So lots of jobs are in the suburbs and people are already traveling to them. And so being able to live closer to where you work is a great thing. And then the second piece on transportation is we need better transportation throughout Connecticut. Like, it's just not a good public transportation system. And I think Sam looked up data, something like 80% of families who live in poverty in Connecticut have cars. So we already have cars, people have cars, people are driving everywhere. What we really need is to have people live in places like Glastonbury and Farmington and Woodbridge. And that will inspire public transportation to go there, because otherwise, why do it? So that's my quick answer.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Aaron and Sam. I think
Thank you.
I mean, I heard it twice this week and I keep learning more stuff every time I hear it. So it's fantastic work. Thank you. Okay. I'm not going to keep us past 5 o'clock, but what I would like your homework, committee members, for our May 12th meeting is, as I said last time, the first iteration of the outline was just kind of a throwing together notes that I had collected, but this one I tried to give it a little more structure and logic and focus on what we were supposed to focus on and so forth. And I'll send this in an email to the group, but I'd like your either before or at the next meeting, is this the right structure? What's missing? What needs to be more emphasized? What should we delete and leave for another committee or another day? So I'd like to come out of basically the month of May with an agreed upon outline of what a report is going to look like, and a good start on parceling out assignments for who would like to put some text to to the out portions of the outline that we need to work on. So with that, yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be happy to go through it because I looked at it and I thought some things were right on and some things were not, shouldn't have been in there at all.
Okay,
Or
well,
the
that's
way
what
that
we,
it, or the way that it was phrased seemed like it could be a little better.
Yeah,
But
okay.
I think that's the process.
Right.
Fair share. I thought it was a really good presentation. I think the first part of it, the idea of understanding why there's a need for affordable housing is important. But the actual fair share part is not really germane to what we're working on. We're working on how to tell towns and explain to towns and guide towns how to create their own affordable housing. Fair share is actually a bill that's pending and doesn't actually exist. So I'm a little, flustered here as to we're listening to this, but it's actually not what we're working on. And it was good to hear. And I'm not saying it was a bad thing to hear about, but we just spent an hour where we're supposed to be working on our goal here to get towns to create affordable housing. And the fair share part is a bill that doesn't exist. So that's just a comment.
Okay, fair points, Matt. I understand what you're saying. I guess my thought process, such as it was that numerical goals are important, and fair share is one way to get there. And maybe in either our next meeting or the next two meetings, I will try to bring in either John Jaskowski himself or focus on how he took the number. It happened to be the fair share number, but came up with some concrete steps. So I was trying to lay the foundation for concrete steps discussion, which I think is part of our charge. But I
Yeah,
I
no,
hear
I
you
agree.
that-
And their analysis there of the X number of
Yeah.
reports that came in, some said they had the background numbers.
right,
That stuff is needed.
right.
So there was part of the stuff was good. So, it's a
Okay.
work in progress.
Very good. Thank you for that. Okay, Alex and Ashley and Erica, thank you as always for your help. And Claudette, I will circle back with the people that you put me in touch with. I have their contact information right here. I will get to that this week. Okay, everybody have a nice day. The weekend's supposed to be spectacular. Get out and enjoy it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.